It can be so hard to tell a decent story. You can't just say this happened and this happened and this happened. Storytelling is the act of the telling, the choice in the telling. It isn't something that just exists as a plotting of events in the ether somewhere for us to just grab and say, look, here's that story. It has to instead be a series of invitations that we're making to a viewer or reader, letting them know to come into a different kind of a world, a different feeling for at least a time. That is so often for me the kindness of a book, is the quiet settling that it invites. Within that settling, I find comfort that's a little bit different. And I want to talk about those decisions and just the beauty in books generally. I was invited to create a tag by Emily of the Linguist Library. She loves language, the sound of it, the differences between languages. She's been learning many languages, and you can see when you watch her videos someone with a friendly, inviting passion for books and the beauty contained in the choices of language in those books. She has a list corresponding to mine. It will be about beauty in books, but far more the lyrical, poetic beauty. And mine is going to lean on the other side of that towards some of the more conceptual beauty that can be found. But both our lists are really a complement to one another, part of the Beauty in Books tag, which is an invitation out to everyone to talk about the beauty that they find in books. One of the first kinds of beauty to think about is beauty in concept, just the phase before the author sits down to actually write anything. What is the idea that they have that has been brewing in their mind for years? And then what is special about that idea? And how does that in itself as a concept have a kind of beauty all its own? When I think of beauty in concept, I think of a single author, Douglas R. Hofstadter. He has a few books that are kinds of devotions to mathematics, systematic thinking, symbolism generally, and translation, especially translation between symbols. What can be both lost and emergent out of that translation process. The first big book that he wrote is called Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And as you can probably tell from the title, it jumps between different fields of learning. With Gödel, we have mathematics, with Gödel's Incompleteness theorem, which attempts to show that within any sufficiently powerful system, it can create a statement within itself that cannot be proven by the system alone. And this is a statement that can refer to all of the ways in which the scaffolding of our logic has to be founded outside of logic. You can't just logically argue your way to logic being sufficient. You have to have some impulse beyond it. This applies to any kind of system that you can think of. If it's consistent enough, then it has enough capacity to create paradoxes within itself. This author, Hofstadter, takes that very straightforward idea. It's actually a very limited idea. It has to be a kind of algorithmic system where on the basis of the rules that it sets for itself, it can create statements. So it uses axioms to then build statements after the fact, which is a very limited kind of sphere. But he takes that idea and he notices analogies in all these other parts of the world. We have the Escher part of the title, wherein you have the artists creating paradoxical images, impossibilities within art. And these impossibilities often involve things repeating in on themselves, things flowing into themselves in infinite loops that just goes and goes and goes. Hofstadter takes this idea of strange loops, of things winding in on themselves, repeating themselves, the way that you can create an infinitely long sentence by just saying, this is a sentence that says, this is a sentence that says, this is a sentence that says. You get the idea. And it can go on forever and ever and ever. And it's that recursive quality of certain symbols where the symbols are capable of reflecting themselves, that then you get something beyond limits within that system. You get something infinite. He keeps going. He keeps playing with this notion of these strange loops. He takes a very personal devotion to the subject matter. It's not just a science book that's trying to teach you rigid science. It's not just mathematics. It's not just art. It's not just history. It's not just music. He's trying to feel his way through it. And as a concept, I find that fascinating. Science is not just a rigid, abstracted, distant effort. Mathematics is born of passion. That human side, that human devotion to connection and maintaining connective tissue between ideas, that human devotion to curiosity is itself a kind of magical thing. It really feels like a book about perception in a lot of ways, like his attempt to capture how do we perceive ourselves and how do we perceive other things, and what is the value of analogy, of figurativeness, of things being able to map onto each other. What does that mean for how we grasp the world and ourselves? And he does an even better job than this book a bit later on with his somewhat follow-up Le Tombeau de Moreau, which is all about translation. It's about translating language. In particular, he has a particular piece. He has a French poem that he's trying to translate, and he notices the formalistic elements of the poem and how in translating into English, while trying to maintain those formal elements, it loses the elegance that it otherwise had in the original language. And yet it is more accurate to mimic those formal elements. And that creates a curiousness to him about how much can be lost in translation, how the attempts to be accurate in meaning to something else by matching the symbols up perfectly, direct meaning, literal meaning, versus purely contextual meaning, how it can change so much that it really almost feels impossible to fully mimic something, even if it's technically accurate. Just like in Gödel Escher Bach, he takes this idea and kind of runs with it for a while and thinks about he had lost his spouse prior to writing the book. And it becomes about, well, like what makes us us? And it becomes about description generally, what is being captured by a word. And is that kind of curiousness about symbols and emergent properties that makes both of these books, just in the concept alone, not entirely in the execution. In many ways, reading these two books feels kind of like philosophy light. If you're going to read other philosophy or other mathematical books that are more academic and serious, then it might feel very kind of soft and misrepresentative sometimes, or a little bit loose in its thinking. But if you just take it as a passion project, as a way to notice and appreciate connections between ideas and symbols, then both of these books as a concept are intensely beautiful. I find myself just appreciating the effort placed within them to contend with complexity and the implications of representation and what that could mean. Then, of course, we have to open stories. We have to send out the greeting of invitation to the reader. For beauty in an opening line, one of the first ones that came to my mind, because I'm trying not to just pick an obvious grand opening line. Obviously, I could have just picked Tolstoy in Anna Karenina or something like that. I wanted to think of an opening line that sets a tone and maintains that tone consistently throughout. And what came to mind was a recent book, and maybe it's because it's a recency bias in that way. I was thinking of the book Satantango by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. The opening of that book sets a kind of atmosphere that permeates throughout the whole thing. This feeling of a space kind of lost to time, drying out and desperate for nourishment. And also a feeling of abandonment, of a whole town being left behind. It describes one morning near the end of October, not long before the first drops of the mercilessly long autumn rains began to fall on the cracked and saline soil on the western side of the estate. In parentheses, later, the stinking yellow sea of mud would render footpaths impassable and put the town too beyond reach. Futaki woke to hear bells. It is that ringing of bells that bookends the first chapter. This kind of mysterious sound, and there's a repetition of mysterious sensations throughout the book. It makes you wonder, is this a funerary bell? Is there death around the corner? What are the noises that they're hearing? And it remains a mystery again and again throughout the opening of the book. And in that first sentence, we have this idea of the cracked soil, fully dried out, arid, incapable of fertility and growth. This ground desperate for water, and how, the merciless rains will come. But of course, once that mercy of the rain arrives on that land, it's also the very thing that creates the mud, which then isolates the town even further. As it says, later the stinking yellow sea of mud would render footpaths impassable and put the town too beyond reach. And so at the point that this town finally gets an escape from its cracked, dry, saline soil with the bliss of moisture from the sky, it then becomes separated all the more. It loses itself. And that opening sentence captures so well the impending doom surrounding this commune in this story. And also the atmosphere that is on display. It's a kind of elongated, stretched out atmosphere of sorrow. There is a lot about this town that is not directly told. So much of the telling of the Satantango story is jumping between perspectives of characters who don't particularly like each other very much. There's a great deal of mistrust within the town. The people themselves are as hardened as the ground that they walk upon. It is that mystery of the bells tolling, these funerary bells, the mystery of other sounds throughout the opening of the book, this wondering about this person who is supposed to arrive, this sense of being saved by something from outside, and then also the misery of what that actually entails when you're saved by something outside of yourself. It is that atmosphere contained so perfectly in that opening line that I think makes it a nice opening line to point to for beauty in an opening of a book. There's another book that I recently received that I want to mention for its beautiful opening. That's because it is a history book that opts to tell itself flowingly, to include the artistry in the telling of the history. And that is this book called The Stammering Century by Gilbert Seldes. It is a book focused on the various cults and sects, religious movements, but also political movements, ideologies, obsessions, the ways that groups can form and then become whole identities for long stretches of time, and how so much of this is blooming on the landscape of early America, in this case 19th century America, due to the separateness, the isolation of all the various towns. Just like the Satantango book, each town its own little space in need of something more, there also emerges a desire for hope and faith, community, bonding. This book, even though it is a history of that 19th century, what seems so intriguing to me, and I haven't finished the whole thing, I really only just started it, is it seems to try to remind us of how extraordinary that difference of voices is. The ways that every voice craving for attention is a kind of deep-seated admittance of some of our most basic desires, and how there is something kind of amazing about having a society of such a mixture of voices, a mixture of seething wants and then expression of those, and how these groups can rise and fall, and it's just these dramatic stories one after the other. It opens in a way that reminds me a lot of like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and this kind of en masse, this individual being captured in the greater whole of the group. It reminds me a bit of the USA trilogy by Dos Passos, how he also opens with a mixture of voices from all across America, and this idea of America itself, that melting pot notion, how America itself seems to lend toward these schisms that also themselves are similar in their deviations, even though they're all trying to be their own thing. And this one opens, the shout of the camp meeting announced the 19th century to the young republic. 99 years later, the disciples of New Thought met in their first annual convention, and their delicate, flute-like tones served as a valedictory. In the intervening years, other voices were heard. To hear voices, especially from the beyond, became a mark of distinction. To be a voice was the supreme good. Greeley called it this stammering century. The air was full of voices. The sharp, hoarse command of the pioneer, guiding his wagons over mountain roads deep in mud. The suave argument of DeWitt Clinton, projecting the Erie Canal. The anxious pleading of Robert Fulton, protesting that his steamboat would not ruin navigation. The precise accents of Eli Whitney, explaining to the government his principle of interchangeable parts in the manufacture of guns. The war cry of the Indians on the western plains, drowned out by the nasal, laconic speech of the Yankee and, later, by the strange, broad tongue of the immigrant, the cries of the 49ers, the yelping of Boston mobs attacking fugitive slaves, the patriotic hymns of William Cullen Bryant, the rounded phrases of Webster, Edward Everett saying, "Our government is in its theory perfect, and in its operation it is perfect also. Thus we have solved the great problem in human affairs. These were the voices which made America." That sounds so similar to so many phrases in reference to America. The mixture of perspectives, the yelling, the desire for influence and power, the kind of worst parts of ourselves, but the best parts of ourselves, all in tandem together. And this book, The Stammering Century, seems like a really, as you can probably tell from that opening passage, it's poetic in its diction. It's trying to map out and enlarge over the history of the space, while also zooming in very closely on individual stories of these little movements that are now lost to time. So much of what's described in this book seems to be things that I've never heard of before, in that they were just kind of rose and fell in immediacy. And that is intriguing just on itself. So this is one other book with an opening, just like Dos Passos USA trilogy and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. It's just these openings that try to remind us of the connective ground that makes up this country. Then there's this question of beauty and character, and my choice for this character is, maybe surprisingly to you, not a literary one strictly. It is one in philosophy, and it is that of Socrates as written by Plato. If you know anything about Socrates, you know that we do not hear his voice directly. We are getting instead renditions of him as a character by Plato, his student. There seems to be many phases of the formulation of that character. There's the early phase of Socrates wherein he doesn't commit fully to points of view, but rather what he does is have ethical conversations with various figures, some of whom are teachers of his day, and he attempts to challenge them on their assumptions and especially how they are defining certain concepts. And then in that process of challenging, he's helping them recognize some of the contradictions inherent to the systems that they've placed down onto the world. It is that early phase of Socrates, prior to the later versions of him where he's far more rigid and really just trying to steer people only in one strict direction. It is that early phase of him as a figure in conversation on ideas with others, and also granting those interlocutors that he spends his time in his Socratic dialogues with, devoting that time to helping them see their own selves, their own points of view in a new way, by kind of trusting them to value reasoning for its own sake, to not just beat someone down and use authority to dismiss someone's idea, but rather to devote to the concept of their value as a thinker. There's an aspiration in certain formulations of him by Plato, and that aspiration is one of openness and curiosity, and also the lesson of criticism and how criticism is not merely destructive. Criticism can be a form of honing down ideas. So when someone is criticizing you in conversation, it shouldn't just be viewed as, oh, look at them destroying this idea I have. If you don't identify with your idea, if you instead can have some distance between yourself and an idea, you can see it rather as chipping away at some of the experiments that I've constructed of my thinking, and then that experiment has failed and now I can move to a better one. It is really an opportunity of discovery. It is that feeling of open dialogue in the early Socrates that feels to me so refreshing as a form of respect and appreciation for the minds of others. The benefit of the fact that it is easy for people to criticize you and it is so hard to criticize your own ideas due to your ego. And so it is really nice to have someone be willing to honestly critique what it is that you have to say. That critique can be a major benefit to you. It could be a testing of your ideas, and that is a gift, to have that kind of testing again and again and again. And it is for that reason that the early form of Socrates as a character, for me, is quite beautiful. There's also that human side of Socrates that you might be more curious about, beyond him as merely a philosopher, or rather merely as a character for his students' ends. And that can emerge out of a biography that was written about him called The Hemlock Cup by Bettany Hughes. I read this a couple of years back on Kindle, And what I remember about it is it captured so well the journeyer part of Socrates, a warrior as much as a thinker, the one who is so worldly compared to perhaps how he's just presented in the dialogues of Plato. And is that worldliness, that needing to actually be in the world, interact with others, appreciate others, that is also an important part of that otherwise conflict oriented, argumentative style. And that is that you can't just think about the world, you have to be in the world. And Bettany Hughes does a great job of first giving us the time and place of Socrates. There's so much about the city itself beyond just the philosopher. And that has to be the case because there is very little directly known about Socrates. But she tries to kind of sketch out the outline of his character. And it is a nice way into the person on top of the character of Socrates. So I just want to throw out The Hemlock Cup by Bettany Hughes as something else to check out when you can. And then there's Beauty and Pain. And one of the best at doing those types of stories is the author William T. Vollmann. There are many kinds of tragedies that he focuses on. One form of pain that I want to bring up is his Seven Dreams series, which is incomplete, but it's really a thematic series. It's not one that needs to be read in any specific order. And what that series focuses on is the interactions between settlers and natives in America. Through the vessel of focusing on those interactions, the author William T. Vollmann gets to wonder about the lives of people very much unlike himself and some of the confusions that can emerge as people of different cultures clash, and there is this incentive to dominate and control, and the panic that can settle in, some of the more seething qualities of ourselves that can take over. The books that have released in Vollmann's Seven Dreams series are The Dying Grass, a novel of the Nez Perce War and how we pushed Native Americans westward for the sake of our personal expansion, and the book Argyle, a kind of retelling of the Jamestown colony and John Smith and Pocahontas, without the simplified love story and Disneyfication of the cartoon. And then we have Fathers and Crows, about the Jesuits in the New World and the attempts to proselytize and shift the natives to a different belief system. You get a little bit of the background of Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. There's scenes of attempts to instill the lessons of the Bible and some of the frustrations of people not understanding those lessons because the context has been removed, and how imposing someone's personal faith can be when it is deemed the right way to be. And then we have The Ice Shirt, about the Norse in the Arctic regions and their interactions with natives. And The Ice Shirt is far more mythologically oriented. It goes back to some of the ancient tales of Norse mythology and then moves forward into the interactions with the natives far later on. And then you have one that I haven't read yet, The Rifles, which, from what I understand, both takes place in modern day with the author William T. Vollmann and his interactions with the Inuits, and also returns to the past attempts to find and utilize the Northwest Passage of the Arctic. All of these books in this series are devoted to pains of cultures clashing, of superficial judgments on people who are unlike you, and also the non-superficial realities of what it is to attempt to communicate and translate and understand one another, and how differences can be quite straining on one's psyche and sense of worth. And so we tend to try to solve that strain by merely cutting away those differences, and the harms that can emerge out of that are really the harms of a lot of human history. Vollmann manages to always zoom in to that pain, and to do so with a painterly quality of description throughout. He can be very blunt. Vollmann certainly isn't for everyone. I'll have to do a whole video on his books, but this series is a great example of taking some of the horrors in American history and making us feel the anticipation of loss and the misunderstandings between groups, the ways that we can be so cruel to one another so long as we believe that the other group is deserving of that cruelty, and how far that view of the other can take us. I want to add in another book by William T. Vollmann that I actually think fits this category even better than the prior ones of the Seven Dreams series. It has a much higher dose of tragic pain and elongated hurt than some of the other books. It really zooms in on that pain by having us engulfed inside of a character whose whole life is now addicted to his most base carnal desires, and he seems incapable of escaping due to his own fixations of feeling unwanted and then needing to have constant gratification. And you're staying in the mind of someone with this addictive thought process. Now, this book is by William T. Vollmann, but I'm going to put it at the end here because I want to insist that you not read this as your first William T. Vollmann book. I think it would absolutely ruin this author for you if this is your introduction to him. It would be so much better for you to read the prior books that I discussed, or his work Europe Central, or his first book You Bright and Risen Angels. There's so many other great books by him. He has a long lineup of excellent books that you should read before the one that I'm about to talk about. The one I'm about to mention is on the level of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, in the sense of pure disgust you're going to feel because you're inside of the mind of someone who is highly immoral and accepting of that immorality without the pushback of kind of justice that you would hope for. It's also someone who is self-reflective, but not in the ways that you would want them to be. You get a character who, in spite of the harms that they're causing, really embraces the joy of it and has a ongoing delusion the whole time. What I'm talking about is the book Butterfly Stories by William T. Vollmann. It sounds like it's a short story collection, but it actually is just a novel. And you're following a character who, due to this neediness born of when he was a young kid, this neediness for affection and love, he becomes committed later in life to just paying for that affection through prostitution. So he goes to Thailand as a journalist. It's supposed to be for some job, but what he ends up doing is spending pretty much all day and all night obsessing over these women who he is paying for sex, finding connections there that are likely not there, and becoming really controlling and fixated again and again on each person. And he's always feeling like he's falling in love, even though there's not the reciprocity there for that to make much sense. But what you get as you read it is that feeling of deep, deep sorrow in the sense of the condition that both of the characters are in. The one paying for the sex, but also the one who's in a financial situation and in a country where they feel that that's what they have to do. But back to back, you're getting hints of how difficult it must be and how his inability to see their complexity in the right way. He sees them as complex in a very kind of idealized way, but he doesn't see them as complex in quite the way that I wouldn't say that he is, because he himself is actually quite simple. The lack of his own complexity is projected onto them. There's something just deeply horrifying and sad throughout the whole book about the kind of codependent relationship that he develops with each of these women. They also need him to a certain extent. Though it is a very personal book, it's also surrounded by the kind of history that's behind the scenes. And you get this like impending doom of that history just always being there, even though it is such a personal story of someone just being consumed by their addiction. The book opens, for instance, just with this sweeping glance at the precursors to those who are now living in Thailand that this main character is taking advantage of. Under the leaning plant tumuli were galleries of wet dirt in which the escapees hid, panting like animals, naked and trembling, gazing up at the flared leaves whose stalks, paler than bean sprouts, wove each other's signatures. Not everybody was caught again. Their families had to be bulldozed into the American bomb craters without them. Wormy dirt pressed down on blood-stained dirt until everything stopped moving, and the slaves were forbidden to work there for a month until the mound had settled. The slaves had no desire to go there anyway. Water buffaloes rooted and splashed slowly in the rice paddies. They were valuable. As for the slaves, there was a slogan: alive you are no gain, dead you are no loss. So the slaves obeyed the rule of absolute silence. After a month, they were sent to plant the grave with cassava. Meanwhile, the ones who had gotten away lived hour by hour beneath the roof of maculled leaves swarming with darkness as they crept toward Thailand, ducking through green-fringed purple leaves, dodging golden berries as hard as copper. Sometimes a landmine got them, and sometimes a snake did. It did not matter whether the landmines were Russian or Chinese because they rended people with the same sudden clap of smoke-petaled flame. But the snakes came in so many varieties as to guarantee an interesting death. One kind let you live a day after you were bitten. Another kind killed in an hour. There was a kind that let you walk 2 steps before you fell down dead. The people who survived the snakes fled on toward Thailand, where if they were lucky they might win admittance to a barbed wire cage. As they ran, they gasped in the strong, wet smell of ferns. Fallen flower bowls, red and yellow, lay in the knee-deep carpet of ferns. In the very humid places, moss grew out of the tree trunks and mounded itself upon itself in clusters like raspberries. From these places ferns burst out, and spiderwebs grew on the ferns, and within the webs the spiders waited. Some were poisonous and some were not. Sometimes the people who survived the spiders became lost and came out into a clearing where their executioners were already conveniently waiting. Sometimes they beat them to death with gun butts. Sometimes they pushed them off cliffs. Sometimes they crucified them in trees. Sometimes they injected them with poison. Sometimes they wrapped up their heads in wet towels and slowly suffocated them. Sometimes they chopped them into pieces. The butterfly boy knew nothing about this. Firstly, because he was only 7 years old and in another country. And secondly, because it hadn't happened yet. It would be 2 more years before he even saw a dead person. Throughout the whole text, there's this distancing between the main character, the butterfly boy, and the women that he's interacting with. And he perceives himself as getting close to them because he has the physical intimacy that he pays for. But of course, what he gets close to is merely the job that they're doing for him. And there's always this language barrier between him and the women that he's interacting with. And he's so frustrated by this language barrier because it feels to him like, oh, I'm not really hearing their words directly. I'm only hearing it through a translator. But of course, even if he could hear their words exactly as it is that they're saying them, he would still be missing so much of the context of what their lives were like and what it was that led to them being in the position that they're in and what it is that leads to him being in the position that he's in and how he can have power and authority over them for just a few dollars. And it is that constant distancing in the book that makes the pain so acute because it feels like someone in this desperate, addictive way trying hard to reach out and find a connection, which so much of addictions feel like you're getting some healing for some wound, but really you're just dealing with symptoms. You're not dealing with the root of anything. And he is always dealing with his symptoms of his need in his poise of constantly paying for sex. But of course, he doesn't find the root of why it is that he's there, why it is that they're there, and what is even happening in this country and what this whole thing is about. And so the book has this edge of history, this edge of pain and hurt, this edge of people emerging out of a long tale of exploitation only to be exploited again by another visitor, who is, in this case, the main character. And that pain is so raw, it is so blunt the way that it's written. Vollmann is not a nice writer. He doesn't write in such a way to gratify. Sometimes it feels like his efforts to disgust are a means of testing your willingness to get close to the subject matter. And then he reveals little hints of beauty after the fact. And it's a bit of a shame that he does that in some of his books, because I do think it turns people away from what is most interesting about what he's doing, because there's a psychological honesty in his writing, especially in the book, The Butterfly Stories, but really it applies to all of his books. It's so painful, but it has such an incredible balance of description and beauty. And there is just this drained journalistic feeling of you witnessing just someone consumed by a drug addiction of people and the use of those people and the normalization of it. There's this strong lack of emotion in certain scenes in the book that really add to the weight of what is happening. It doesn't feel registered or spoken of in quite the way that you would expect. I think for beauty amidst pain, The Butterfly Stories is such a remarkable, honest look at what that deep harm of power and authority over others can lead to. At no point does Vollmann judge anyone, really. The whole time he's writing the book, he's giving everyone their chance to be as pathetic as they are. And there's something beautiful to me about that. It stands out for that element. The fact of just kind of the honesty of how pathetic we can be, how much we can be consumed by something, how much we can devote to something, even if it harms us, even if we're harming some other person. We can forget how bad it is because it feels so good. And he finds a way to really hone in on that. There's plenty of books that try to wrap themselves around a sick mindset, but this one wraps itself around that sickness, but doesn't imprison it within the confines of how it is normally spoken about. For Beauty and Incompleteness, we have an author who aimed high, but wasn't able to finish what he aspired to. This is Mark C. Danielewski's The Familiar series. I have the first 5 books in that series to show you. And what you'll see immediately is how elaborate the design appears to be. Each of these is quite thick. And they were released, if I remember correctly, with like 2 books a year. And it was this plan that he was going to release 27 books total. If you know anything about the author Mark C. Danielewski, you know that he plays with form in a wide variety of ways. And what you'll see in these books is a lot of mixtures of characters and their language and imagery and sort of breaking the fourth wall, kind of toying with a possible strange narration over top. There is a chaos that builds as each book in the series moves from one to the next. With formalistic play generally, there's this idea that that use of that form will have some kind of payoff in the end. Because this author was planning this 26-book series, and we only got the first 5 before it was essentially canceled or at least put on hiatus, we never get to know precisely where that formal structure was leading in terms of its match to the substance of the story. And the story itself, in terms of what we've been introduced to, is fairly simple. It's about this young girl, Xanther, who found a cat. And there's something special about this cat. And it seems and suggests that it's going to connect this one character to the 8 other characters in the story, whose perspectives we leap into very completely, leap into in the sense of the text itself begins to model itself around how they think in their own minds. So we even get their dialect of speech, and we even get the frame around their thinking framed much like how they're perceiving the world that they're in. Throughout this constant switching up of framing, we are getting a reminder of the differences in how we're all framing our world. And there was this feeling like all of this was going to connect. It was building so much, and the margins between the groups, the boundaries between these groups of people was starting to break down by the end of the 5th book. You were seeing the page itself expand in bigger and bigger ways. And then, of course, the series is now cut off. And so for Beauty and Incompleteness, I like the idea of the Familiar series. There are aspects of its execution that sometimes felt quite quaint. It wasn't quite as literary as I wanted sometimes. However, there was also moments where it felt precisely where it needed to be. It was simple in its beauty sometimes, and it was very satisfying in that simplicity while keeping the form alive always throughout. There's going to persist a curiosity around where this was headed. What was the build-up being created? Why did it need to be so many books? What was the desire there? And if you give the author the benefit of the doubt, you would assume there was something of worth in that bigger picture that he was attempting to paint for us. And now it is gone and lost. The first 5 books in the series can still be enjoyed for the attempt, for this kind of building up, this winding up of something right before release. And we never got to see where it was headed, but we at least get some of that winding for a while, especially the textual play. If you like that in your reading, if you want to just play with language a while, then this is one of those books, a lot like Danielewski's other works, although I think Only Revolutions is my favorite of his. He's always playing with form. And this one is playing with form in a way that, even though the story itself is very simple, it is almost just the potential that you're thinking of the whole time that really makes it worth reading. This feeling like, where could this go? And of course, we're never going to know, because this is in the category of Beauty and Incompleteness. For beauty in place, I'm going to talk about a book that doesn't really have the grounding of an actual place at all. It's really more about our relations to the places that we pass through, or at least the places that we aspire to be in. The book is Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, and he is known for his odd surrealist play, these little bite-sized stories that he churns out, such as in Cosmocomics, or some of his strange experimentations with form, such as in his book about the book that you're reading, If on Winter's Night, a Traveler. He's always restraining himself with formalistic rules to then push his creativity on the edge. And that was really a part of the group that he was a member of, which is the Oulipo crew of writers, who always were putting limitations on their writing in order to use those limitations as stepping stones to then climb on top of to reach higher points. And this book, Invisible Cities, is presented as snippets of a conversation between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan, in which Marco Polo is describing the various cities that he had visited and trying to share them with Kubla Khan. And Kubla Khan is obviously growing more and more skeptical as it goes along, because these cities are, at first, they seem merely impressionistic or poetic, but as it goes along, they get more and more absurd, more and more surreal, less possible. And it is that nonsensicalness of each city as it builds and builds that really begins to emphasize the perspectival aspect of being in a place. These cities, as they become more and more nonsensical, become less the outer architecture of a city and more the inner prisms that reflect bits of the outside. The accumulation of all of these little vignettes starts to feel very much like just an accumulation of memory and associations and playing with the limits of what words can mean. It's sort of like the free play within words, how we can stretch the meaning of those words for our own ends in all sorts of ways. I should give an example of one of these cities. They're all very small little paragraph descriptions. So here's one of the early ones so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about with this strange book. When a man rides a long time through wild regions, he feels the desire for a city. Finally, he comes to Isidora, a city where the buildings have spiral staircases encrusted with spiral seashells, where perfect telescopes and violins are made, where the foreigner hesitating between two women always encounters a third, where cockfights degenerate into bloody brawls among the betters. He was thinking of all these things when he desired a city. Isidora, therefore, is the city of his dreams, with one difference. The dreamed of city contained him as a young man. He arrives at Isidora in his old age. In the square there is the wall where the old men sit and watch the young go by. He is seated in a row with them. Desires are already memories. And you see how so much of what that city is was not the city as lived in, not the city as touched and known. It was the city dreamed of, the city anticipated. And so much of the cities that we are in, I live near Los Angeles. My grasp of the city is so much the grasping of what I've been told about the city. I haven't been to every block, every street. I haven't known every person. I haven't risen at the earliest of dawn to visit each place as soon as the sun rises. I don't know what it's like throughout the city. Most of what I grasp of my own city, in spite of my explorations throughout it, is really impressions and imaginings of what it would be like. Broad scope kind of painting on top of the briefer impressions that I've actually directly had. In that kind of passage, you get that perfect example of how the city is really so much of what you imagine the city to be. The city is not something really known. Even though there's this constant unreliable narration throughout the book, and even though Marco Polo is clearly exaggerating and playing, and even though there's this suggestion that really he's talking about one city and it's really his machinations around that city, that single city that he's describing, it's not a series of separate cities. Even though all of that is the case, it also reminds us of how we can be unreliable to ourselves, how we can then put a word onto something and then think, oh, I know it now. But of course, we'll never know a city. That word is not a simple object in our hand. It's really just something used to describe something so big, so vast, with particulars. And it is really only those particulars that we can know. And that is a fascinating element of this one book, Invisible Cities. For beauty and time, I have to bring up the obvious master of describing time, of stretching it and then contracting it back again. And that is Virginia Woolf, in particular, her book, Orlando, which I'm sure you've heard of Orlando at least a little bit. It is a fake biography of a poet who lives for multiple centuries. I think it was 3 centuries. And in the process of the story, they switch genders. They go from a man to a woman. And it is that switching of gender, that movement through time, that really becomes a story about the changes that time brings. But also the ways in which our sense of self, we of course become many selves. And just like with Invisible Cities, how the word city can mark down and erase away so many of the particulars that make up an actual city. The word self can stamp down and make us forget how different the many selves in our lives have been. The ways in which when you were 4, you were nothing like who you are at 12, and nothing like who you are at 20, and so on. And yet we call all of that a singular self. And there's all sorts of philosophical musings you can go off on about the nature of that description of self, but that is too much of a tangent in this case. Of course, Virginia Woolf is so good at taking a story like this, of having multiple centuries in one person's life, of having the experience of more than one gender within a main character. She's so good at taking those shifts and changes and making us really feel the suddenness of them, but also the compactness of each shift, the ways in which, in spite of these changes, there is some elements that remain the same. One thing that's notable is Orlando is a poet throughout the whole thing. And so Orlando always has a yearning, a sensitivity to the world, and a sensitivity to love, and a desire for love. Even though they go through many different loves throughout the book, there's still this constant in who they are of seeking love. And so in much the same way that we change throughout our lives at all the various ages that we have, there can be something that makes us us that is maybe harder to pin down, maybe something that is more ephemeral, but it is still that thing, that desire, that drive that becomes the thread that holds us together. Throughout this book, Orlando, even though the time is changing, even though everything is dramatically shifting, Virginia Woolf does a fantastic job making sure that we feel all of this is circling around the one center that holds. And that center that holds is beauty in itself, the desire for beauty, the desire for love, the desire for poetry, to be a poet, to capture the world. And that is that little bits of Woolf herself, that poet in Woolf, that element of her desire to hold the world in language, to somehow capture it, or at least capture something truer than even what is explicit in the world. She's such a great writer of time. I want to give an example of how she kind of compacts time very quickly. In chapter 6, she writes, Orlando went indoors. It was completely still. It was very silent. There was the inkpot. There was the pen. There was the manuscript of her poem, broken off in the middle of a tribute to eternity. She had been about to say, when Basket and Bartholomew interrupted with the tea things, nothing changes. And then, in the space of 3 seconds and a half, everything had changed. She had broken her ankle, fallen in love, married Shelmardine. There was a wedding ring on her finger to prove it. It was true that she had put it there herself before she met Shelmardine, but that had proved worse than useless. She now turned the ring round and round with superstitious reverence, taking care that it should not slip past the finger joint. And you get this kind of suddenness of the shifts of life, the ways that life itself can kind of get out of your control. And it can feel almost as if, wait, where did that time go? What happened to me? How did I end up in this particular place? Sometimes we make decisions that we don't realize are as permanent as they are. And throughout this book, we get these little moments of time having shifted all around her, almost as if she had been so lost in her own inner musings of poetry that she had not noticed the ways in which the world was moving past her. Virginia Woolf is so exceptional at these kinds of stories. She's one of my favorite writers. I'll have to do a more detailed video on her, but I do just have to mention, for beauty and time, I think Orlando is one of the best. The final choice is going to be for beauty in catharsis. It's a kind of release of tension built up over time. A friend of mine recently finished this book, and I think that's why it's come back to mind. I decided to grab it off of my shelf and peruse it all over again and try to remind myself of what a strange structured book this is. It is going to feel like a very obvious choice, in the sense it's a very well-known book, but it is worth appreciating how unusual this book is, and the fact that it is so big, it's one of those great American novels, really almost doesn't make sense because of how much it requires of you as a reader, how much patience it requires, but also how much it actively goes against your desire for that catharsis. And that book is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And this is one of those books that I read for the first time in college, and I think that was probably the best way to do it because I had a professor who really went into detail about a lot of the structure that was going on in this book. But one of the things that always stood out to me about it was that detail, that way that the author was telling a story and it feels like a swashbuckling adventure. We're going to go out to see, oh, look, this is just something that this main character is doing to deal with their boredom of day-to-day living. We're going to go on this whale hunt. We have a clear target. The target is this white whale that Captain Ahab is obsessed with. And over time, there's clearly this built-up obsession more and more. We're noticing how much of Captain Ahab's well-being is being wound up in this object far, far away. In spite of that clear momentum that is being built up, Herman Melville has these long chapters that become encyclopedic and obsessive itself with the whale. Just like how Captain Ahab is consumed by his need for revenge against this white whale, the author of this story is consuming us, trying to get us to understand the whale in some way. The more that the author tries to give us the facts about whaling, the facts of the parts of the whale, all of these details of ships and what goes into this whole process, the more the information is being doled out and thrust at us, the less clear that whale becomes, the more distant it is. It's a reminder of the ways that sometimes getting information about a thing isn't a way to know the thing at all. Really, that information is a stultifying stiffness to kind of wrap something in cellophane and then call it mine. And what you're doing is you're killing the thing in the process of trying to know it. And Captain Ahab is so obsessed with getting to this whale. By the time that he gets there, there's that, I hope you don't mind me spoiling the ending of Moby Dick. He ends up getting consumed down into the waters with the whale. You would expect, based on the kinds of descriptions that Herman Melville had offered prior, that there was going to be this great moment of the whale finally being described, us really relating to it and connecting to it. But in that moment, it is still beneath the water, and Captain Ahab gets consumed down with it, and so too the rest of the ship and the crew, and really there ends up being only one survivor left, and that is the writer of this story. And so we finally get to that moment of being able to know that whale, our chance to have it tangible before us, and of course that gets lost down into the sea. And really, for the thing to be alive, for the thing to be itself, it cannot be known. In order to know it, you'd have to freeze it in time. You'd have to have it flat on the page. It kind of reminds me, there's this great story called We Love Glenda So Much in this short story collection by Julio Cortázar. In this story, you have a crew of people obsessed with this actress, Glenda. And they're so obsessed with her, they adore her, they watch her movies again and again and again. But of course, as they become more and more obsessed, they start to want to cut away at the inconveniences, the elements of her personality that don't match consistently with what they know of her, because they want it to be consistent. Much like if we are trying to understand whales, in the same way that Herman Melville gives this broad description of everything that makes up a whale, what we're getting are only the samenesses in whales. We're not getting the thing that makes every individual whale its own thing, which are the differences. And that has been cut away. And in that same way, in the short story, We Love Glenda So Much, we have these people who are obsessed with this actress, Glenda. They start to cut away the things that don't match up, that are uncomfortable in how much they don't match up, because what they want is to own the thing. By the end of We Love Glenda So Much, in this desire to own, in this desire to control, they, of course, discover the only way to do so, the only way to stop her from deviating from their expectations, is to kill her. And that is their true love. Their love is to force her to fit the image that they have in their mind. It's a great reminder of how much we can only know the thing here. We cannot know the thing directly. I can never know, no matter how much I talk to you, I can never know what it's like to be you. I can never know you in that kind of a way. And you can never know me as much as I can try to express it, because it is always going to be filtered by something, much like all stories have to be mediated. Just like how we started this conversation with this idea that stories are hard to tell. Stories are something that don't exist in the ether, and neither do you too. You are going to be mediated by my impressions, by the time that we're in, by what it is that's happening right now. The whale that exists that is being hunted by Captain Ahab is going to be mediated by his impressions of that whale, by the story that he's telling himself about what that whale is. Glenda, in the short story about the actress, she's going to be mediated by their entertainment, by their desire for entertainment, by what they hope from her rather than what she would desire for herself. And anything that differentiates her from those expectations now becomes something harmful and painful and wrong. And it is that need to stop things in order to know them that is so much that kind of boxing of things. So that's why I bring up Moby Dick for beauty in Catharsis, because I think it's a book that builds the tension better than any other by really frustrating the momentum that it tries to create. And then by the time we finally get to that end, we get a solid end, but it's also frustrated because the whale that had been built up for so long still remains distant, and now Captain Ahab has been consumed along with it. It's sort of an absence that the whale is, and it is that absence that is so satisfying to me. It's a different kind of catharsis because it's a reminder of all the absences that we can never quite attain. Those are the many books that I wanted to bring up for this Beauty in Books tag. There are so many other books that I could have brought up, but really I want you to participate. I want you to join in, help introduce us to some of your favorites for this Beauty in Books tag. And as always, if you're curious about any of these books, I put the title down in the description with a little Amazon link if you want to check it out. But otherwise, thanks for watching. I hope that I helped you find some great books to read in the future.